Good afternoon and welcome to this next session that, as you already know, is focused on the priority for G20 for our planet. We will have important guests on this session. We will discuss with them about the future of our planet, that is now a question that need to be addressed without any hesitation. We know that we need new policies that are aimed to ensure a long-term sustainability for our planet. Sustainability become the key word for our future, together with the transition towards a carbon neutral economies. So we know that for G20 is an important challenge to understand how can contribute to the a new multilateral effort that need to be focused on two different sides, as we can say. The first is that we need to protect the environment and promote a sustainable growth, because we know that after the pandemic crisis we need a strong growth, but a growth that has to be sustainable for the future of our planet. On the other side, we need to restart the growth based on a new paradigm. And we'll talk about crucial topics such as the transition that I have already mentioned, but also the option to fight the climate change, water, food. These are some of the topics that we will discuss with our panelists. But before, I would like to show you a couple of keynotes. The first is by Alicia Barcena, that is the Executive Secretary the Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean. And after her, we will hear the top priorities for G20 for our planet from Fatih Birol, that is the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. So let's hear them, let's listen to them, and then we will discuss with our guest.
It is a pleasure to send my greetings to the government of Italy and to the participants of the virtual Inception Conference, the first official event of the T20. I am pleased to share with you ECLAT's stance and priorities on making the planet cleaner and safer in the session focusing on planet and people. COVID-19 pandemics has demonstrated the limitations of the current development paradigm, at least in Latin America and the Caribbean. This region is characterized by severe environmental impacts and rising inequality. Actually, inequality defines this region. In response to economic impacts and the looming climate crisis, and in order to pave the way for building back better, we have identified 7 sectors that could be the drivers of low carbon and inclusive recovery. First, renewable energy transition. Second, digital revolution. Third, electromobility for urban transport. Fourth, bioeconomy. Fifth, circular economy. 6, healthcare manufacturing. And 7, sustainable tourism. For example, if the region invests 1.35% of GDP every year between 2020 and 2032 to transition the region's energy matrix to non-conventional renewable energies, we could create 7 million jobs and carbon emissions will be reduced by 30%. Increasing the recycling rate, another example, coverage of materials and developing local production chains in the circular economy could create almost 450,000 stable jobs and boost the region's GDP by 0.35%. We should remember that middle-income countries, not including China and India, account for 96% of developing country debt. ECLAC proposal, for example, to establish a Caribbean Resilience Fund is a concrete example of linking debt relief and debt sustainability with green industrial policy, infrastructure, climate resilience building, and adaptation. The fund would be financed through debt reduction representing 12.2% of total public debt of Caribbean cities, amounting to only $7 billion. This is possible. ECLAC stands ready to contribute with its analytical and convening capabilities in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we count on the T20 support to put forward and support transformative policy ideas for an equitable and green global recovery. Thank you.
Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, greetings from the International Energy Agency headquarters. 2021, this year, will be a pivotal year for energy and climate. I say energy and climate together because, in fact, our climate challenge is essentially an energy challenge. Energy that powers our daily lives, our economies, makes our lives more comfortable, more productive, is at the same time responsible more than 80% of global emissions. So it is the reason International Energy Agency is putting clean energy transitions at the heart of its work throughout this year. And again this year, I have reasons to be optimistic. At least three of them. Three reasons. One, many countries around the world made strong pledges, commitments to reduce emissions to zero by 2050. European Union, Japan, Korea, Canada, China, and soon I expect United States made major commitments. And I believe many other countries will join this club. The second reason I am optimistic is that trillions of dollars of stimulus packages, economic recovery packages, will be injected to global economy, and more I expect countries would put clean energy incentives in those economic recovery packages. Third, this year there will be a very important climate summit in Glasgow. United Kingdom, together with Italy, is presiding, and I expect the world leaders will come together and come up with hopefully binding targets for our world energy and economic system. In order to support the Glasgow COP26 meeting and other international meetings, we are going to publish world's first roadmap to reach net zero by 2050 in May. Thank you very much.
Now let me introduce to you our first panelist, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, that is director at the Center for Sustainable Development at the Columbia University. Good afternoon, Professor Sachs.
How are you? Thank you very much. Thanks to the Italian G20 for hosting this, and to the T20 process. I'm absolutely delighted. We have, in fact, three big interconnected agendas: decarbonizing the energy system, as Fateh Birol just emphasized, sustainable land use to stop the disaster of loss of biodiversity, and that will be taken up at the COP15 in Kunming, China, of the Convention on Biological Diversity in October, and making the world food system work properly to produce healthful foods for all and in a sustainable manner. And that will be the subject of a special summit at the United Nations in September. So September, food; October, land use and sustainability; November, Glasgow and COP26. This is a big and complicated agenda. Governments need a new kind of planning and policy. Every government should show up to COP26 with a plan to decarbonize their energy system by 2050. This requires a new kind of analytics, a pathway analysis. And this is happening in many parts of the world, but many governments are still looking at 2030 or 2035 and incremental steps, not understanding that we're on a different mandate now, which is to get to zero by mid-century. Similarly, governments need clarity on land use policies to stop the loss of biodiversity, and the food system issues, which will be taken up in September, are even more complex because diets around the world are unhealthy. Many people don't have enough to eat. 2 billion people lack vital micronutrients, and 1 billion people are obese, largely because of unhealthy food processing by our food industry. These are all interconnected challenges, though, because land use is a major contributor to the greenhouse gases, sometimes estimated to be 1/4 or 1/3 of all greenhouse gases emanating from the land, whether deforestation, other land degradation, methane release, nitrous oxide release, and so on. Food obviously depends on land use. Our dietary choices, too much beef in feedlot cattle, leading to too much pressure on the land for feed grains, leading to deforestation and destruction of forest margins. So my basic point is that we're on a different kind of politics and planning now. Thanks God we have a new government in the United States of rationality and commitment to environmental sustainability, strong commitment. This means that Europe, the United States, China, Korea, Japan, Canada, UK, many other countries are taking strong commitments. We need to back those strong commitments with a new kind of analytics and new kind of policy to solve these problems, not just talk about them, by showing the pathways to sustainability and doing that pathway analysis for these three huge interconnected sectors: the energy system, the land use in its full complexity, and the food system, from farm to fork, as the European Union says. So we have a lot of work to do. I think the T20 members can play a very big role in this kind of comprehensive pathway analysis this year, and we must hold our governments accountable for moving beyond incrementalism and nice words to clear pathways to sustainability. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. You were very clear, a lot to think about. And now I would like to discuss with you about the World Happiness Report, in which you coordinated that report, in which is written that sustainable development is a key dimension for the human well-being. Can you explain something more about that? What does it mean for also for the G20? And so what could the G20 achieve this year to help this concept of sustainable development that is so close to our well-being? human being.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the first point is economics got off on a different track 2 centuries ago when it said that the goal of the economy was wealth. And when everyone was poor, that made sense. But our goal now has to be well-being, not wealth. What is the point of gaining the world if you lose your soul, to quote the Bible? This is really the issue now. We don't need more wealth if it ends up destroying us. That's not well-being. So we measure well-being by asking people about the quality of their lives in the World Happiness Report. And we see that the countries that are moving to sustainable development are also the countries with the highest well-being. You can have a rich country like the United States, but until recently, we were not oriented to sustainable development, and we were not very happy either. So the idea of our economies should be well-being, not wealth. So we have to get off the obsession or the addiction with GDP as being our purpose. It's not our purpose. Our purpose is human well-being. And once we understand that, then the 3 pillars of sustainable development, meeting economic needs, social justice and inclusion, and environmental sustainability are all key pillars of well-being. And we therefore need to reorient our purpose and then reorient our policies. And part of this is overcoming our long-standing addiction and misunderstanding, thinking that money is the route to happiness. We should have known from our ancient philosophers and sages that that's not quite right. And now we really see that the desire for wealth, if it is just uncontrolled, is leading to our own self-destruction.
Thank you, Professor Sachs, for such an important speech. Your words were so inspiring, and we will discuss with other guests. And I know that you have to leave us, so thank you for being
Thank you. Great to be with you. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. And now I will introduce to you our panelists. Are with us Fahad Al-Turki. I know that there were some technical problems, but probably now we are able to see him. Not now. Okay, now we will talk with the other panelists. I will say hello to Camilla Bausch. Good afternoon. That she's the Scientific Executive Director of the Ecologic Institute from Germany. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
And I will welcome also Ernest Zemunit, that is a co-chair and Chief Executive Officer of the Nuclear Threat Initiatives. Good afternoon.
Good morning here.
Yeah, of course, because you are in the United States. So good morning. Mr. Munitz, I would like to start with Camilla Bausch. In the meanwhile that we are solving some technical issue, and that we were able also to introduce to you Mr. Fahad Al-Turki, that is the Vice President of Research, King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, that I can see. So welcome to Mr. Al-Turki. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for inviting me.
I will start with you. And my first question is about the fact that you chaired the last year T20 during the Saudi G20 presidency. So could you please give us a kind of overview of what you have been achieved on this matter, in particular in the fields of sustainability and the renewable resources and energies. And if you can also address us about how can we start from the Saudi's legacy of the last year about these items.
Well, Sarah, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to connect again with the T20, and I would like to congratulate the T20 Italian Secretariat for arranging such a very impressive inception, a very good start of the year for the Italian presidency. I specifically congratulate my dear friend Paolo Magri for work well done on the inception. Of course, you know, Saudi Arabia was hosting the T20 last year. And of course, as you and the audience know, last year was very difficult in terms of absorbing the initial shock of the pandemic. But it has also been a unique year where the leaders of the G20 have met twice, one at the end of March last year and then at the summit at the end of the year. Of course, the legacy, the contribution of the think tank community was very impressive, with nearly 150 policy briefs, more than 600 or 650 authors, more than 500 institutions participated, massive number of countries, even beyond the G20 countries. Out of the 32 policy proposals that were proposed during the T20 Saudi Arabia presidency, 48% was accepted and endorsed by the leaders of the G20. In relation to the energy issues, as you mentioned, as you know, energy is one of the main pillars of economic prosperity, along with food as well as water. And for sustainable energy, Saudi Arabia have dedicated during last year a special task force to deal with sustainable energy and sustainable resources. But in particular, we were focusing on the affordability and sustainability and also security. So it's not only the sustainability, but also affordability and security of these resources, food, water, and energy, as these are the center of geopolitical and economic prosperity. We have called to promote measures that support technology and innovation for sustainable and stable global energy market, preserve energy security and market stability for a prosperous future, overcome policy fragmentation to promote innovation for sustainable water, energy, and food access. I think the last part of the question is what needs to be done to build effective T20. And here I would like to highlight 4 main points. The first one, I think T20 need definitely to strengthen the role of the Troika and to ensure continuity between presidency, between the previous, the current, and the future. It should also strengthen legacy issues. We heard through the day today the role of the multilateralism, measures to help tackle the pandemic, and issues related to both vulnerable societies and economic development across the board, not only on G20 countries, but other non-G20 countries. This third item, I think, building on the legacy of Saudi Arabia of nearly 70 countries participating, underscoring the inclusiveness of the T20 should be a priority for all the presidencies. And I think being the voice of the South is going to be an important element for the success of the T20. And last but not least, we saw a huge participation from the MENA region last year, and we hope this will continue, and the MENA region, as well as in Africa, will have an opportunity to recommend policies, practical policies that apply to their countries, and resolve the issue of these countries being underrepresented under T20. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Turki. I would like to say that if you have any question to our panelists, please send us. We will have a final Q&A session in our discussion. Now, I would like to ask to Camilla Bausch, as we as Mr. Alturki said, last year we were at the very beginning of the pandemic of the COVID-19. So I would like to ask you a question about that. And because the pandemic crisis, we know that will have a long-term impact on our societies. So what is, in your view, the expected impact in particular on our fight against the climate change? Is the reduction, we saw a reduction in the CO2 emissions last year due mainly to the lockdowns, but that was just a one shot, in your opinion?
Well, I think the impact of the pandemic on climate change are quite multifold. And I think our action in 2021 will decide whether the impact will be positive or negative with respect to solving the climate crisis. Why is that? Well, let's first look at the issue you just mentioned. We have seen an unprecedented drop in emissions in 2020. Some estimates suggest a 7% dip. But this is not a reflection of a targeted transformation towards climate-friendly economies. It is not a reflection of sustainable structural change. Instead, it is, as you have mentioned, a result of the economy holding its breath and massive encroachments on a broad range of civil liberties, not least the freedom of movement. Furthermore, if you look at history, this dip might only be transitory. The economic crisis in 2008 and 2009 led to a dip in emissions by 1% in 2009, just to be overcompensated by a rise of emissions in 2010 by 4.5%. Also, the UNEP Gap report, by the way, warns that this might be only a transitory dip in emissions, which we saw in 2020. So what does that mean if I say the situation will be decided in 2021? I think there are three decisive factors which will determine whether the impact on climate change will be positive or negative. The first one is, will policymakers be able to devote adequate attention and time to solving the climate crisis, despite the urgent need to react to the health crisis and the economic downturn? Will they find the necessary will to set in place the necessary frameworks for a transition towards a climate-friendly transformation? And will they take a long-term view and live up to their responsibilities towards future generations? Second, we look at the trillions of dollars spent in recovery monies. How will these measures be designed and implemented? Will they be, these monies, invested in a way that allows us to get onto a pathway to a climate-friendly future? Because as Jeff Sachs just has mentioned, we are not on a pathway yet. And the UNEP Gap report actually warns us we are heading towards a 3-degree world instead of a well below 2-degree world as agreed in the Paris Agreement. So will government invest in these technologies and infrastructures which are fit and compatible with a climate-friendly future? Will they support the jobs which are compatible with the climate-friendly future while avoiding lock-ins and stranded investments? And third, will we be able to take the lessons from the current pandemic and use them to be better for the future? So will we use the lessons, for example, on the fragility of systems and the importance of resilience? In panel 1, this has just been discussed and also shown that if you don't have a resilient system, it will become a social problem. The social disadvantaged are hit the hardest. Second, the importance of scientific advice for policymaking. Third lesson on the importance of the precautionary principle. Lessons about the way we can change our ways of acting, performing. For example, now having a virtual conference here instead of traveling. And last and certainly not least, for the T20 group, will we be able to learn some lessons from the new modes of research cooperation we have seen during the pandemic when searching for vaccines, and maybe take some of this to be better and stronger and faster when searching for solutions on the climate crisis, and as Jeff Sachs has just mentioned, maybe also on new approaches to find pathways towards a climate-friendly future.
Thank you, Dr. Bausch. Very, very clear and very important also how you explained all the lessons that we need to learn from what we are living today and what we were going through in the last year. So I would like to ask to Mr. Monitz about an issue that has been already addressed from Professor Sachs, but also from Dr. Bausch and also from our other panelists. It's about the global energy transition that is the central goal for the G20 agenda. So I would like to ask you, what are, in your view, the most urgent policy issues that we have to focus on the energy field, in particular and specific to the energy field?
Well, thank you, Sarah. Let me first say that I think the G20 and the T20, first of all, need to adopt very clearly the framework of net zero emissions in the roughly mid-century timeframe, and not forget beyond that a net negative economy. And I'll return to that later. Now, within that framework, I think the G20 can draw upon the diversity of the economies in the group, certainly much more diverse than the G7, for example. And the G20 can really emphasize how the deep decarbonization solutions will naturally be very different in different countries and regions in the world. And therefore, the discussions on the road to Glasgow need to emphasize much, much more than frankly has been emphasized, that solutions must have maximum optionality and flexibility so that different countries can meet their own needs in their own ways. That will involve broadening the discussion that unfortunately often takes place in limiting options. So, for example, approaches like carbon capture and sequestration, carbon dioxide removal, advanced nuclear need to be part of the discussion. Not that everyone will follow those pathways, but they must be part of the set of solutions. Similarly, very important issue that many frankly don't want to discuss. What is the role of natural gas in the energy transition to maintain reliability and resilience through that transition? It's only with this emphasis on optionality that one can also build the kinds of political coalitions that one will need for success. Labor and jobs will be central, but so will business. And in fact, the often demonization of business in this context really has to be changed into asking the question, how can we make them part of the solution as opposed to part of the problem? Otherwise, we will just lengthen the time that it will take to reach our goals. Secondly, a second big policy bucket, I would say, is the question of energy access in the least developed countries. We have to acknowledge that, frankly, these countries are going to place development ahead of their climate obligations. And it's going to be up to us in the G20 to see that that need for development, economic development, is met. We need to provide the resources, the $100 billion a year that's been discussed now for some time, and of course, make that growth as sustainable as possible. And a third major area where the G20, I think, can assert leadership is resolving the issues of trade. Obviously, trade, international trade today is under a lot of stress. in many of the multilateral and bilateral relationships of the major economies. But as we head towards low carbon, and different countries do so in different ways and in different at different paces, we will need to find ways of rationalizing that trade so that we don't have carbon leakage and the movement of manufacturing, for example, because that will defeat our carbon goals. And yet we have to have trade in commodities, for example, in ways that support the second objective of energy access and development in the least developed countries. So I think these are three major areas where the G20 coming together can have an enormous impact in our ability to go towards net zero.
Thank you, Dr. Moon. It's very clear about the policy that we need to implement in order to reduce our emission. And I would like to talk about that also with Mr. Al-Turki, because as we know very well, you come from a country which is a major producer of fossil fuels. So we would like to ask you, how do you manage the energy transition, and can you help us to understand how a country like Saudi Arabia, but in general, how can we find the current balance between sustainability and economic growth? Because this is one of the main issues, the big challenge that we have in front of us as a T20.
Very, very interesting question. And building on what Ernie mentioned, I think we must acknowledge that alternative resources or energy resources are expanding. Despite that, the world will continue to rely heavily on fossil fuel for meeting the growth in demand, driving both economic and social development. Under the Saudi presidency last year, we have proposed the circular carbon economy, which was endorsed now by all G20 leaders as a holistic, integrated, inclusive, pragmatic approach to manage emissions. It encompasses the broad range of pathways and options available. The CCE, or the circular carbon economy, consider different national circumstances. Developed and developing countries, countries with natural resources and countries without natural resources, while at the same time striving to meet our shared global aspiration to meet the climate challenge. The circular carbon economy is an energy strategy that advocates the 3 R's of the environmentalism. So it advocates reduce, reuse, and recycle carbon. But critically, it also adds a 4th R, which is remove, in an effort to eliminate emissions from the atmosphere. And that makes up the whole energy strategy to address emissions and carbon under the circular carbon economy, with the 4R: reduce, reuse, recycle, as well as remove. So any solution we think about in relation to the energy transition should be also practical and sustainable. And within that framework, we should utilize all energy resources and innovation and technology, which will offer us an opportunity to further advance clean energy transition. A CCE strategy is a key factor that will definitely strike the balance between sustainability as well as economic growth for different circumstances for different countries.
Thank you, Mr. Al-Turki. And I would like to ask to Dr. Bausch that we know that this year, the 2021, is also the year of the COP26 because it was postponed from last year due to the pandemic crisis, of course. And the co-chairs will be Italy and the UK. So do you think that the time is now ripe for G20 can build a political momentum in the view of the COP26?
Thank you for this question. I actually think that politically it's an interesting year for the climate agenda. It's full of opportunities, but also of challenges. And look at the opportunities. Jeffrey Sachs just mentioned the lineup of environmental summits and meetings. I want to look at a quite unusual lineup of presidencies. So we have the UK preside over the G7 summit in summer. We have Italy preside over the G20 summit in October. And then we have UK and Italy together preside over the UN climate negotiations in November. So this lineup can actually be used for building momentum towards the climate summit in Glasgow and a strong outcome. And it was just mentioned that, for example, go to net zero could be something interesting to work towards, and thinking of the more than 120 countries who actually committed already towards that goal, there's quite an interesting dynamic toward that. Fatih Birol said it's a pivotal year for energy and climate. I want to say this climate summit is of particular importance because countries are expected to ratchet up their ambition with respect to climate protection, so the world can finally get onto a pathway compatible with the Paris Agreement. And to contribute to solving this climate crisis, I think the G20 have to address their carbon-heavy economies and their structures. While I'm very aware, and it became evident during this day again, that there are very different positions of G20 members, and Paolo Magri also mentioned these tensions, on climate especially, they should, in my view, address issues like the following three. Make green recovery a key element of their work. This will be paramount in this year, and it will be paramount for getting on the right pathway. And it has links, as has been mentioned, to climate, biodiversity loss, land degradation, all these issues which are already on the G20 agenda. It could actually be the basis for a global initiative on green recovery, which could be then strengthened at the climate COP. But let's see. We can go into detail if we have time. Second, I think they have to show their commitment by ratcheting up their climate ambitions as they have submitted in their NDCs, as long as they have not done so already. And I think, for example, the sign of Europe being more ambitious for 2030, that's already very positive. I also think, third point of many, and some have been mentioned already in this event, the phase out of fossil fuel subsidies really has to be followed up upon. More than 10 years, it's under discussion of the G20. We have to see action and an end date for this. The world needs a concrete date and needs progress on this issue. Due to time, I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bausch. I have a last question for Dr. Monitz. Then, if we have time, we are receiving a lot of questions from our audience. So, Dr. Monitz, I would like to talk with you about an item that, of course, showed up with a lot of the previous speeches, and it's about the carbon neutrality that is an ambitious goal. And we need a multilateralism kind of approach to tackle these issues. So I would ask to you, what kind of role can G20 play in setting up new instruments to pursue this ambitious goal?
Well, thank you, Sarah, for the question. Let me actually emphasize not a new instrument, but some new directions within an existing instrument. Namely, I'd like to emphasize that to reach the net zero and eventually net negative economy, we are going to need a lot of innovation. Frankly, I think there's a misperception often stated that we have all the tools we need and some kind of magical political will is all that's missing. No, actually, we need some serious innovation, in fact, to get some new tools. For example, long duration storage, not just simply battery storage, would be one example of that. In 2015, 20 countries, in fact, came together. Now it's a few more than that on something called Mission Innovation. It's a commitment to really supercharge innovation. I believe we need to do that right now, starting now in this decade, if we are going to have the tools that we need 15 years, 20 years from now to scale and reach net zero. Now, but within mission innovation, which I think we need to really energize much more than that has been the case in the last 5 years, to do that, there are new directions where multilateralism is a complete natural. I'll mention one that's very, very critical. If we are going to get to net zero and then net negative, by definition, we need negative carbon technologies. So carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere, from the upper levels of the ocean, is an example of an area that we've done very, very little on. It's enormously important. It's a great opportunity for multilateral collaboration. That's the kind of initiative that we need. It would be certainly new within the mission innovation framework. So with that, thank you. And I'm afraid that I'm going to have to leave the conversation quite shortly.
Thank you for being with us, to Ernest Monitz, and thank you for your important contribution to this discussion, to the T20, and thank you also from me. It was very interesting, your contribution. Thanks.
Thank you.
So now we have probably a couple of minutes to go through some of the questions that came from the audience. The first is for Dr. Bausch. I'm reading with you. Given the digital and economic divide in the wake of COVID, how the G20 can foster inclusivity, as Professor Sachs already mentioned before, is a main goal of a sustainable development, and keep the SDG Agenda 2030 on track?
Well, that's a big question one could talk long about. I'm not quite sure if I have the perfect answer for that, but I think that the SDG agenda with its goals set out actually should be a pathway towards the future, which we really have to keep in mind also with the G20, and it is sometimes neglected, though it has inherently some fraction that. Now, thinking of the what I understood, the digital economic divide, yeah. I must say that I'm not quite sure how to exactly place it content-wise, but let's say the economic divide, I think it is paramount that when the G20 gets together, they have a strong eye on that and think how to deal with that. It was in the first session already strongly addressed as a challenge because, as we said, the most vulnerable are hit the hardest, not only by the COVID pandemic, but also by climate change. Now, the digital divide, you can see how that also, especially in these times, hit again the most vulnerable the hardest. So this goes hand in hand. If what exactly the digital economic divide is, I would love to discuss further, but I think I don't even know who asked the question.
No, but this is an important question, a huge question, because of course we know that we are also discussing how to spend all the funds that will be investing to rescue our economies after the COVID crisis, and to solve the digital divide is one of the main issues. But I would like to ask a very, very last question from the audience to Mr. Al-Turki, and how can, in your opinion, what do they think about the role of house renovation as a key factor to lower carbon emission with the benefits, so also for the economic growth? What do you think about that?
I think again, for lowering the emissions to reach an average zero carbon by the second half of the century, I think this is critical to be adopted within any strategy or a practical solution for to achieve these goals. I think within the circular carbon economy approach, that has been embedded, and not only Saudi Arabia have proposed that last year, and it was endorsed by the G20, but it's translating that into actions within the country, incorporating innovations and different mechanisms to not only reduce, reuse carbon, but also to remove carbon. So some of the initiatives that have been taken within the kingdom, for example, that adopt innovation, is to utilize the carbon mix within the kingdom, as well as build on the natural resources that are available to produce low carbon fuels. As you know, probably there have been great investments within the last few months on hydrogen, including blue hydrogen that was traded for the first time across borders between Saudi Arabia and Japan. There are certain plans to invest in green hydrogen in the northern part of Saudi Arabia. So utilizing different approaches, utilizing innovations to reduce carbon footprint is going to be essential part, and it is embedded within the circular carbon economy approach that was introduced last year.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Farhad Al-Turki. Thank you also to Camilla Bausch. Our time is ended, so thank you for being with us. Thank you for all the inspiring arguments that you brought us. I hope that you find this discussion interesting, and that we have to enlighten some of the issues related to the sustainable goals, to the sustainable growth that could be the priorities for the G20 on these matters. Thank you, everybody, and please stay with us, because the next session will be focused on prosperity. Thank you also from me.